translation. So as you're joining, please note that people will be speaking in both French and English during this event, and simultaneous translation is available. So look for the globe icon at the bottom of your screen with the word interpretation, and click on that to select your preferred language. You can choose English, French, or no translation. Donc, bienvenue tout le monde. Nous allons commencer dans quelques minutes. Juste en attendant, je vais dire quelques mots par rapport à la traduction. Donc, veuillez noter que les personnes parleront en anglais et en français pendant cet événement et qu'une traduction simultanée est disponible. Donc, juste rechercher, vous avez qu'à rechercher le petit icône du globe en bas de votre écran avec le mot interprétation et cliquez dessus et sélectionnez la langue de votre choix. Donc, vous pouvez choisir anglais, français ou aucune traduction. So once again, everyone, we'll get started in just a few minutes once everyone has joined. Vicky, are there still quite a few people in the waiting room at this point? Or
yeah,
still
folks are
joining?
just trickling in. So I think if we can just give it another minute, that would be great.
Okay, great. So we'll just wait another minute here. Okay, and for those of you just joining us, we're just waiting for everyone to connect. And I'll just remind you all again about translation, the translation that's available. So people will be speaking in both French and English during this event. So if you would like translation, just look for the globe icon at the bottom of your screen with the word interpretation. You can click on that and select your preferred language, so English, French, or no translation. Donc, bienvenue tout le monde pour ceux et celles qui se joignent à nous qui n'ont peut-être pas entendu mon petit explication par rapport à la traduction. Veuillez noter que nos intervenants et intervenantes aujourd'hui parleraient des fois en anglais, des fois en français, et une traduction simultanée est disponible. Donc, recherchez l'icône du globe en bas de votre écran avec le mot interprétation. Vous pouvez cliquer là-dessus pour sélectionner la langue de votre choix, donc soit anglais, français ou aucune traduction. And Vicky, how are we doing with the...
Yeah, the speed of the pings has slowed down, so I think we're good to get going.
All right, great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's press conference. My name is Shannon Franson, and I recently joined the Climate Action Network Canada team as the new executive director. I'm joining you this morning from unceded Indigenous lands known as Tsotsiake by the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, also known today as Montreal et Montréal. Today, we will be presenting our vision for the upcoming Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. COP26 starts in Glasgow in less than 1 week, and Canada must step up. We've compiled our recommendations for how Canada can turn the tides on climate change in a document entitled A Manifesto of Resistance. To discuss the challenges we're facing at this COP and how Canada can seize this opportunity to show real climate leadership, I'm joined today by my colleague Eddie Perez, the International Climate Diplomacy Manager at Climate Action Network Canada, by Harjeet Singh from Climate Action Network International, by Dale Marshall from Environmental Defense, by Émile Boisseau-Bouvier d'Équiterre, and Alia Hirji of Climate Strike Canada, who will be joining us in just a few minutes. We are also hoping that Amber Bernard of Indigenous Climate Action would be able to join us today, but unfortunately, she had to cancel at the last minute for family reasons. We would, however, like to strongly encourage everyone to check out Indigenous Climate Action's resources on decolonizing climate policy, including their recent webinar series, which is available on their Facebook page. My colleague Vicky Koo is here, our communications lead, and she will facilitate a question period for journalists at the end of today's presentation. If your Zoom name doesn't at this time include the publication you're writing for, I'd ask you to just take a couple minutes to rename yourself to include that information. Please note that we are recording and a video will be posted online after this event. I now welcome my colleague Eddie to give us an overview of our recommendations.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for those remarks. My name is Eddie Perez. I'm the International Climate Diplomacy Manager for Climate Action Network Canada, also based in unceded Kanien'kehá:ka land in Tiohtià:ke, which is commonly known as Montreal. We are heading towards one of the most exclusionary and unsafe COPs. Even if the UK keeps saying that this is going to be one of the most inclusive summits, actually the risk of this summit becoming a virus super spreader is real. I want to start by thinking about all participants, delegates, journalists, heads of state, civil society, people coming from the global south who are taking a huge risk to attend the Glasgow summit. For Climate Action Network Canada, COP26 represents a clear moment of resistance. The COVID-19 has brought us to our knees and has shown the vulnerabilities of our economic, social, and political systems. You know, this pandemic showed also how risky and dangerous it is when countries and leaders ignore science and take a me first approach. We go to Glasgow with a huge belief that we need to fight for climate justice and that climate justice today is now unstoppable. We're seeing climate action happening at the domestic level with local communities and citizens changing the status quo in city halls, with young people going to the streets for the past 2 years every Friday, and courts forcing governments to increase ambition. We have seen it in Canada with the Supreme Court on the carbon pricing rule. But we know the resistance is actually helping, particularly led by tribal nations, indigenous water protectors and land defenders, pipeline fighters and grassroots organizations in what is called Canada and the United States, to stop the equivalent of 1/4 of emissions from these two countries. On all matters, when it comes to negotiations on keeping 1.5 within reach, to climate finance, to the rules on Article 6, this is a moment for the people, the planet, and justice. It is a moment of justice because in this era of painful, more severe, and frequently unequally distributed losses and damages, we rise. The people are rising to keep 1.5 within reach, to unlock the global transformational, equitable, and just energy transition away from dangerous fossil fuels, in particular from Canada, and to expose those who promote and intend to promote false and dangerous solutions in Glasgow. We are going to work hard to close the finance gap, the loss and damage gap, the adaptation gaps, and the climate governance gap. I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate finance delivery plan that Minister Wilkinson delivered today, and then move on to our overarching expectations for Canada. Success at COP26 lies in the ability of rich countries like Canada to close the unfair finance gap. Minister Wilkinson today, along with State Secretary Flashback from Germany and President of the COP26, Alex Sharma, have put together their delivery plan to show how rich nations would meet the annual 100 billion commitment. I personally thank them for their honesty. This document is certainly not a plan to deliver the 100 billion in full and on time, and is a failed attempt to provide hope on climate finance. By pushing the target to 2023, we will only see the results of climate finance flows in 2025, the year when this commitment comes to an end and we start talking about the post-2025 goal. But the main story today is not about developed countries' good faith to deliver more climate finance. On the contrary, the question that I think we all need to ask is, does this document show how urgent it is for rich nations to massively scale up climate finance flows to help developing countries transition, adapt, and finance increasing and painful losses and damages? The clear response coming from this document is no. rich nations are saying that the world needs to wait for them, needs to wait for Italy, Australia, the Netherlands, and France, and all of those countries who have decided not to step up their climate finance pledges to close the 100 billion gap in 2021. For the past 12 years, the governance of climate finance flows has been opaque, with accounting disparities by contributor countries, problems with accessibility, and a growing reliance on loans, including non-concessional ones, which has contributed to the increase in unsustainable debt burdens in developing countries. This delivery plan was an opportunity for them to address these concerns, and it didn't. So today we're asking COP26 President Alok Sharma to convene ministers in the beginning of the COP26 so that these concerns are addressed. We ask COP26 Alok Sharma to acknowledge the need to unlock trillions to respond to the needs of developing countries in line with a 1.5 future. These ministers must also agree on an annual review of the 100 billion efforts that includes each country's contributions to this effort. All risk countries must also come up once and for all, agree on increasing adaptation finance to at least 50%. We also need to learn from the failures, the continuous failures on climate finance in the context of discussing the next post-2025 goal. And I think my colleague Harjit is going to speak about this, but any discussion on finance in Glasgow must get developed countries to support the call from vulnerable countries to agree on mobilizing additional resources for losses and damages. I'm going to turn now to our overarching expectations with Canada, and then I'll pass it off to my colleague Harjit. Over the course of the year, we have seen Canada increase ambition when it comes to the delivery of Paris pledges. Canada has put forward an enhanced NDC. It has doubled its climate finance contributions and has also put forward sectoral announcements to increase their emission in key sectors. On paper, the federal government has enhanced its performance, but its inability to drastically reduce emissions at the domestic level continues to hurt Canada's international credibility. Prime Minister Trudeau has announced today that he will go to the G20 in person, and then he will attend COP26. Our overarching ask for Prime Minister Trudeau is Canada needs to step up. In Glasgow, Canada must acknowledge the inadequacy of current efforts and use COP26 as a relevant opportunity to show it's ready for nothing less than a rapid, fair, just, inclusive alignment of overall climate policies with a 1.5 compatible future in light of equity, solidarity, and reconciliation. Thank you. Back to you, Shannon.
Thanks so much, Eddie. And we'll now turn to Harjit Singh from Climate Action Network International, who will touch on issues of global inequity and the unequal impacts of climate change internationally. Over to you, Harjit.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Eddie, for setting the context. I would start with saying that climate action by rich countries has been a story of denial, delay, and deception. And same can be said for climate finance. As you heard from Eddie, we are nowhere near where we have to be when it comes to supporting developing countries to adopt a greener pathway as well as deal with some of the climate impacts that we are seeing around the world. But we need to recognize that developing countries have least resources to respond to those disasters. The responsibility of rich countries was very well established way back in 1992. It was very clear that rich countries have to take the leadership role in reducing their own emissions, but also support developing countries. It took us several decades to arrive in Copenhagen to announce a target of $100 billion, which came out of thin air without any ground analysis. And the reality is that 12 years have passed and we are still not seeing that money being delivered. So the climate impacts that we are seeing today is because of the inaction that we have seen over the last 3 decades. And we were expecting that the delivery plan that has been announced today at least will bring back some confidence and trust into the system, considering how Global South is struggling to deal with the impact. The impacts are everywhere. We are seeing wildfires in Canada, US, Turkey. We have seen devastating floods in Western Europe, China, and India. But it's the poor and most vulnerable countries who really do not have resources to deal with these impacts. Before they recover from the previous disaster, the another one hits them and hits them harder. So unless and until we do real action, both in terms of reducing emissions back home and also supporting developing countries with real money, we will not be able to deal with the problem. We find that rich countries often do not recognize the continuum of climate action. Mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage are part of the same continuum. Less action we take on mitigation, we will have to invest more to adapt. And less we adapt now, we will have to deal with more loss and damage. And somehow we have seen that rich countries take a very straightjacketed approach. And many a times they've got the sequence wrong. Expecting developing countries to step up in terms of their emission reduction target before putting money on the table, that's absolutely unfair and inequitable. And countries who are already facing loss and damage, imagine how they can divert money from providing relief and humanitarian assistance and rebuilding and recovery to solar panels and wind farms. Is that really possible? When I put myself in the shoes of a finance minister in a developing country, I find it impossible, which means that you need a global system which is based on responsibility, accountability, and solidarity to support developing countries. And unless that support is made available, we will not be able to deal with this situation. And I think it's high time that rich countries and countries like Canada recognize their responsibility. And the reason I said deception, we're moving forward from denial to now we are at a state where we continue to delay. But there's also a lot of deception in terms of how we calculate climate finance. It's full of loans. $100 billion was supposed to be public finance to unlock trillions, as Eddie was referring to. UNFCCC has come up with a report that $6 trillion are needed just to fund 40% of the climate plans that they have received. So we need trillions. And we know all the money doesn't have to be public, but $100 billion was supposed to trigger and leverage that kind of mobilization of trillions. But if $100 billion itself is not real and we are just busy with dodgy accounting, it's not going to help us make that transition. So it's really important for rich countries to make sure that the money that is delivered is real. Developing countries are supported to adopt cleaner pathways, and loss and damage that they are facing right now needs to be addressed by providing a new stream of finance so that they can be helped. The current humanitarian aid is not sufficient, and majority of disasters that we face are climate related. And just to give you an example, developing countries are going to face damages to the tune of $290 to $580 billion a year by 2030. That's the kind of scale we are talking about. And rich countries have resources. Germany that faced floods recently was, did not find it difficult to mobilize 30 billion euros or $35 billion to just recover from one episode of floods. So while rich countries have resources, developing countries need support to recover from these disasters. So as Eddie said, it's really high time that we make sure that climate action is real. And we provide support to developing countries and make sure that this COP is a success. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harjeet. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dale Marshall of Environmental Defense, who will speak about the importance of pushing for Canada's highest climate ambition at COP26, including ending fossil fuel subsidies and the critical importance of aligning our energy pathways with a future where global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Dale, over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. Good morning, everyone. We have high expectations for COP26 for Canada to increase its ambition in terms of what its pledges under the Paris Agreement. that includes international climate financing, which you've been hearing about in terms of emission reductions, and in terms of public financing for fossil fuels. Some say that what matters most is action and not targets. And that's somewhat true, but you actually need both. You don't do big, important things when you aim low. And the truth is that despite recent progress in terms of Canada's pledges, Canada is a laggard in terms of both action and ambition. In the G7, Canada's emissions have gone up most since Paris was agreed to. We have the weakest 2030 target, and we provide the most subsidies and public financing for fossil fuel development on an absolute basis. You know, even though there are countries that are bigger and have more resources. Canada's fair share is much higher than what the country has put on the table. Climate Action Network and its members have done the assessment and said that Canada needs to reduce its emissions by 60% by 2030 domestically, and add to that an additional 80% reductions that can be obtained through investments in overseas countries through cooperation. The Prime Minister actually told the world and Canadians why Canada wasn't aiming higher. At the Biden summit in April, he said, Canada can't do more because we're a big exporter of oil and gas. As if that's something that federal governments can't do anything about. The truth is that the international agency has laid out the pathways to net zero in 2050 and maintaining temperature limits at 1.5 degrees. And the scenario that was laid out by the IEA was no new investments in new oil and gas fields and no new approvals of fossil fuel projects. And there are some countries that are aiming for that, where COP is going to see the official launch of Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, countries that are looking to phase out its fossil fuels by doing exactly that, no longer approving new projects and phasing out those industries. But for Canada, instead of using federal powers to stop the expansion of the oil and gas sector, the government has been fueling the climate crisis by, pouring billions into the oil and gas sector itself in subsidies and public financing. Last year alone, those together, subsidies and public financing, totaled $18 billion. Again, highest in the G7. We'll also be hearing quite a bit about methane emissions at this COP, because there's going to be a new global agreement on reductions. And here again is an example where action matters as much as pledges. Canada has a 2025 target for emission reductions of methane. Last year, the figures that came out of Environment and Climate Change Canada showed that Canada wouldn't reach those. There'd be a significant gap to that target based on the regulations. And environmental groups urged the government to strengthen the regulations and insist that provinces follow suit. And Minister Wilkinson refused. And so what we're going to get at the COP is a new shiny target for 2030, which raises ambition in terms of reductions. But what we do need are, in the short term, stronger regulations that at least meet or beat the 2025 targets. So the challenge for Canada, the challenge that we're giving the federal government is to really step up at COP, to do our fair share in terms of emission reductions, to do our fair share in terms of assisting developing countries and their efforts, to stop the public financing of fossil fuels. And there will be countries that will be discussing those kinds of initiatives, spearheaded by the UK, to put the resources that are needed instead into adaptation and loss and damage. And of course, through all of this, uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dale. Maintenant, je vais passer la parole à Émile Boisseau-Bouvier d'Équiterre, qui nous parlerait de comment le Québec peut faire sa juste part à COP26. Émile.
Merci beaucoup, Shannon. Bonjour à tous. Je tiens à souligner que je suis sur le territoire de la nation Kanien'kehá:ka, connu sous le nom de Tiohtià:ke, aussi connu sous le nom de Montréal. Donc, puisque Équiterre rejoint totalement les demandes et les attentes du réseau Action Climat à l'échelle fédérale et internationale, je vais me concentrer sur certaines des attentes d'Équiterre à l'échelle provinciale. La première, c'est l'ambition. On souhaite voir une réelle hausse de l'ambition climatique du Québec. L'accord de Paris stipule que les États doivent rehausser leur contribution déterminée au niveau national à chaque 5 ans. Plusieurs juridictions l'ont fait, dont le Canada, insuffisamment, malheureusement. Mais le Québec ne l'a pas fait. Pourtant, le Québec s'est lié à l'accord de Paris par décret en 2016 et il se doit donc de rehausser son ambition. À ce sujet, nous allons faire une annonce ce jeudi, une annonce conjointe avec le Réseau Action Climat, avec la FTQ, avec Greenpeace, avec Nature Québec, avec la Fondation David Suzuki, avec Oxfam Québec, sur quelle devrait être la cible 2030 de réduction de GES du Québec à l'échelle domestique pour que la province réussisse à faire sa juste part de l'effort climatique mondial. Parce que la contribution climatique du Québec ne peut pas se résumer à des exportations. Ça ne peut pas se résumer à des exportations de technologies vertes, à des exportations de produits décarbonés, à des exportations d'hydroélectricité. On est face à une urgence climatique. Le Québec a un réel devoir d'introspection. On a un réel devoir de revoir notre ambition climatique à la hausse. Et nous allons vous donner plus de détails sur quelle devrait être cette cible ce jeudi. Donc, je vous invite à rester attentifs. Nous communiquerons avec vous à cet effet. Aussi, je tiens à parler de l'annonce du gouvernement la semaine dernière. Mardi dernier, François Legault a confirmé son intention de mettre fin à l'exploitation des hydrocarbures au Québec. Il s'agit d'une excellente nouvelle. Il s'agit de la bonne décision à prendre, mais on veut être certain que le Québec va assumer son rôle de leader en la matière jusqu'au bout à cette COP26. Comment est-ce qu'il peut le faire? Bien, premièrement, en rejoignant la Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. C'est une initiative lancée par le Costa Rica, lancée par le Danemark, qui permettrait au Québec d'utiliser ses liens diplomatiques pour mettre la pression sur d'autres États, entre autres en Amérique du Nord, pour qu'ils le rejoignent dans la fin de l'exploitation des hydrocarbures sur leur territoire. Et puis, comment le Québec peut jouer son rôle de leader aussi, c'est en s'assurant de faire les choses comme il faut, en utilisant les pouvoirs qu'il possède pour adopter une loi qui interdit l'exploitation ou l'exploration des hydrocarbures sans verser d'indemnités financières aux entreprises. Les efforts du Québec, les investissements collectifs des Québécois doivent se concentrer sur la transition socio-écologique, ne doivent pas venir dédommager les plus grands pollueurs qui sont la cause même des changements climatiques. Donc, en résumé, ce qu'on s'attend de voir du Québec, c'est un rehaussement de l'ambition qui est nécessaire et aussi jouer son rôle de leader dans certains domaines, entre autres sur la fin de l'exploitation des énergies fossiles. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Émile. Et pour conclure, I'm just going to pass the puck to Alia Hirji of Climate Strike Canada, who's going to talk to us about youth engagement at the COP and their expectations for Canada in Glasgow. So Alia, you can go ahead. Yeah, thanks.
There we go, sorry. Hi everyone, my name is Alia. I'm a youth climate justice organizer with Climate Strike Canada, which is the local Fridays for Future chapter. I'm in so-called Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, also known as Toronto. All 25 of the past Conference of Parties, starting in 1995, have failed to ensure a livable present and future. Before I was born, my life was on the line and world leaders delayed, and delayed. How many more young people who are at risk or haven't even been born yet will be failed by COP26? Every year, we are continuously promised a conference that will put us on track for climate justice. But since the Paris Agreement, Canada's emissions have only risen and our policies, alongside countless other countries, are insufficient. Every passing year, the world's chance at limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius slips further out of reach. Incremental action is not enough. Our only hope for a successful COP26 is drastic, ambitious action worldwide. A lot of young people, including myself, grew up thinking that the UN is a place where world leaders work together in the interests of the people. But COP26 is sponsored by polluters, has many barriers for marginalized people, and is starting to fall out of touch with reality. It's hard for us as young people to still have hope, and we need this COP to conclude with policy that coincides with the crystal clear science. Global temperature rise must be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Anything even a percentage of a degree above means greater catastrophe for present and future generations. We can no longer delay what's necessary, an end to the fossil fuel era. No new projects starting now, and a supported just transition for current industry workers into green jobs. Net zero isn't zero emissions. The focus on net zero at COP26 allows the continuation of pollution disguised by carbon offsets. While they often use this buzzword, net zero quite often, we need a plan for an actual zero emissions. And the fair share must be taken on by global North countries, like Canada, as well as respect and reparations for damage in global South nations and Indigenous communities. Over the last decade and a half, countries in the global North that profit off climate change have been barriers to making international climate conferences like COP a place for ambition and climate justice. Watering down and weakening language, policies, or targets at COP26 puts all of our lives at risk. The priority at COP26 must be ambition like we have never seen before. A tall ask, but a necessary ask. Pay close attention to the compatibility of Canada's position in negotiations with the science, and a reminder that it's not just climate change, it's a climate crisis, a crisis of the past, present, and unfortunately, the future. Hold COP26 accountable for people across the world and for the future generations who will inherit it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alia. So well said. And I'm going to make a little connection with your last comments about crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, we have learned that not responding to crisis or responding with poorly coordinated and half measures is not only ineffective, it's really highly dangerous for all of us. You've heard today that in order to face the looming climate crisis, Canada must go all in, or we will fail to protect our livelihoods and our future. We're really grateful to the Canadian government, and I wanted to take the time to say it today. We're really grateful to Canada that they have supported a strong participation of civil society organizations at COP26. Because of this support, the Climate Action Network Canada, our team, our member organizations, our partners, we will be on the ground at COP26 to push our political leaders to step up. And we will be reporting every day on their progress. We invite you to follow our network's posts and our publications over the coming weeks and to join us in our fight to save our future from the imminent threat of climate change. We will now open the question period, so I will pass it over to you, Vicky.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and thank you to everyone for joining us and for sticking with us. So we're going to start the Q&A now. If you have a question for any of the panelists, please just put an asterisk in the chat and we'll just take those in the order in which they appear. And just as we're waiting for folks to put those in, I wanted to let everyone know that we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this, as well as with contact information for all of the panelists, so that if you want to arrange interviews at any point, you know how to get in touch with them. So we're going to start off with Mia Radson. Mia, please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I'm sorry, I missed the first few minutes, so this might have been discussed already, but the climate finance report that was put out by the UK and Canada and Germany today, they seem to be suggesting that developing countries will be fine with this because that financing will be there maybe by 2025. What do you think the reaction is going to be, and what kind of impact is this report going to have on the negotiations in Glasgow?
Thanks very much, Mia. Eddie, do you want to start off with that? And then perhaps Harjeet, if you have anything to add, you can go ahead.
Actually, Harjeet, you're coming from India. Do you want to start on that question, and maybe then I'll give our remark there. So maybe Harjeet.
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think it's really important to look at finance as a real important aspect of the success for COP26. And also, as I was saying earlier, it is important to look at it from a sequencing perspective. There's a lot of pressure on developing countries to raise ambition. There's a lot of talk about net zero targets. But when it comes to finance, there is no clear roadmap. And what has been delivered today is a delayed plan. And then we expect developing countries to come up with a plan where they are going to change their policies for greener development. How can that happen? So clearly it erodes trust, and it doesn't give enough confidence to developing countries so that they can make those changes in their policies and structures. So climate finance is absolutely fundamental. And another important thing, which Eddie also said, that $100 billion is the bare minimum that is required to unlock trillions that are going to be needed to the kind of transition that is needed. And here we are stuck with that $100 billion, and we are not even making that real and then delaying it again and again. So it's absolutely fundamental for the success of this COP and the real action on ground.
So maybe just to add to what Harjeet said, I think, the response to this delivery plan from the developing countries who have set specific expectations on climate finance, but also from groups and communities globally who are looking to this delivery plan as an opportunity to start COP on the right foot. The main question they needed to answer is, how urgent do developing countries feel climate finance flows are needed to close the finance gap? And from this delivery plan, this urgency is not being shown. One of the reasons why that is because this delivery plan doesn't actually help say who gave money and who didn't. We need to know which countries are not delivering their pledges. I know because I like climate finance, but this should be public information. Italy has not provided climate finance. Italy is the G20 president this year. Australia has not committed to increase their pledges. France has not committed to increase their pledges. The Netherlands has not committed to increase their pledges. EU countries like Spain have not committed to increase their pledges. And so what happens when a group of these rich countries are not able to fulfill their needs? They have to try to find excuses in a delivery plan that remains incomplete. And so I think you would expect that if the commitment in this document is that in 2023, they're going to deliver the 100 billion, we're only going to know if they did it in 2025. And that is what they needed to fix with this delivery plan, and they didn't, because now the projection is that we will need to wait to see if they will be able to scale up. That is unacceptable. Where in 2021, it was supposed to be met in 2020. And that means that we need to address the erosion of trust in the beginning of the COP, and that responsibility lies in the UK presidency, who needs to get ministers from developed and developing countries to discuss these issues urgently.
Thanks very much. Mia, do you have a follow-up, or does that answer the question?
I do, although it's somewhat unrelated. I'm just wondering if you would also be able to talk about Article 6 and what you think those talks the outcome of those talks will be.
Sure. Yeah, so essentially, the expectation for this COP26 is to make some kind of progress on Article 6 rules that have not been able to be agreed in previous COPs. From a CAN perspective, we are extremely concerned about an outcome on Article 6 that ends up hurting the environmental and social integrity of the Paris Agreement. Because of the push to agree quickly on rules and to make trade-off on Article 6, we might end up actually impacting the possibility for increased ambition during this decade. Article 6 might actually help all companies and those who are claiming false net zero solutions to buy credits to compensate and delay climate action. Critically, I think that many will be focused on how Article 6 intend to make progress. From a technical perspective, there has been a lot of talk about it, but we also need to focus on what COP26 needs to deliver to make sure that the world actually believes that there is a possibility that actually Article 6 can support the implementation of the Paris Agreement in the short term. I am not seeing it right now. And so there are two steps that need to happen at COP26. The first one is countries like Canada need to prove that they actually can use Article 6 in a way that it doesn't hurt the environmental and social integrity of the Paris Agreement, and that it doesn't impact human rights and indigenous people's rights. And we're really far from it. And the second one is, it is not about the technicalities of Article 6. It's about the consequences of weak rules that will have violent results in communities and people where these rules might affect them if these projects get approved. So essentially, I think it's going to be a difficult issue in the negotiations, but we shouldn't lose focus on the political consequences of bad rules, because there are technical negotiations that have not been sorted out for the past 3 years.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Next question is from Rafi Pichakanian.
Thanks very much for that. I wanted to know, at the news conference this morning, Canada's Environment Minister appeared to blame the private sector for failures to meet the previous climate financing goals. And I just wanted to have a sense from you, do you think that is a fair assessment of what has happened?
Yeah, thank you, Rafi. No, this is their blame. They were the ones in 2016 who projected $33.2 billion in mobilization from the private sector from 2016 to 2020, when they put forward their 100 billion roadmap in 2016. And at that time, many experts told them that those projections were wrong. We got to 2019, and there was a huge gap. While finance coming from public sources and multilateral development banks had plateaued, the part that where finance was not coming from was the private mobilization piece. It is not up to private sector to blame at this point, because it was the projection coming from developed countries. It was their responsibility to fill this gap before in 2015, and they didn't. Now we're in a situation again where they need to make these projections because they are not getting all the developed countries to step up on their pledges. That is why they're now talking about surpassing the 100 billion and looking at projections beyond the 100 billion with private mobilizations. And so we're at a place today, a similar place than in 2016, where we need to rely on some kind of hopeful private mobilization when we know that the 100 billion should be all public sources, and it should be all grants finance. And so, critically, I think that is not a blame that should take place, because the rules on the 100 billion, developed countries were the one who decided it from the start, and they are failing their own pledges, they're failing their own rules, and they're failing their own projections.
Thanks, Eddie. Rafi, did you have any other questions or a follow-up?
I did, somewhat related. You've mentioned the idea that what we need is actually trillions of dollars that the 100 billion would help unlock. Could you elaborate on that? Could you give us a sense of exactly what you mean by trillions and what that would be useful for?
I think it's for Harjeet, that question.
Yes, sorry, that was for Harjeet Singh. Thank you.
Okay, I can start. When India announced its Climate Action Plan, or NDCs as we call it, the figure that it quoted in its plan was $2.5 trillion are required by 2030. And that required for the range of climate action, from mitigation, adaptation to dealing with loss and damage. Africa just a few weeks ago has analyzed that it would need at $1.3 trillion a year by 2030 to meet its climate action requirements. As I said, UNFCCC's own analysis said you need $6 trillion. So the amount of money that is required for real action has always been about trillions. And why do you need $100 billion? It's to unlock. Now, how that unlock happens is what kind of policies that you create. And $100 billion is just drop in the ocean. Look at the trillions that we had to mobilize as part of our COVID recovery plans. So you need money to change policies. You need to invest in research institutions. You need to make sure, and then half of it is for adaptation. And then you also need to make sure that you are creating right kind of policy instruments so that you can attract $1 trillion of investment. Now, where has that happened? Also, when you talk about developing countries, capacity building is an important element. Most developing countries do not really have a capacity to analyze the kind of market instruments that they have to create, or how do they attract private sector, what kind of investment they have to make in changing their policies. So it's basically putting that basic policy framework in place, making sure that you have right kind of capacity of human resource, and you are able to invest in your public institutions that are then ready to attract that kind of money, which has not happened. So what rich countries do not realize that by delaying the delivery of 100 billion, we are actually delaying the financial flows that need to happen in trillions. And if I connect with your previous question, we are blaming private sector for not investing, but have we created enabling conditions? Have we set a target which is ambitious enough, which also gives direction to the private sector that, yes, that's the direction to go? Because private sector thinks of 20, 30 years. If they have to make investment, they need that political direction that this is where the world is heading, and that's where they have to invest, whether it's technology or about reducing emissions or about making investments in clean energy in developing countries. So all that has not happened. So that's why $100 billion is so critical to leverage. And we continue to see delay of that, which is going to make things very difficult. And if I add one more point, the impact that it's going to lead to, and I'm talking of climate impact, if we delay climate action, which means more climate impacts, they are not limited to developing countries. Everybody is facing, also people in the global north. So I think, citizens of global north also have to demand more action, and the delivery of $100 billion is going to help developing countries where you have most mitigation potential now. So, you look at it from any dimension, delivery of $100 billion as public finance is absolutely fundamental.
Thank you both.
Thanks. And Eddie, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Maybe I'll just say that, we're now in the process of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We're not, negotiating a treaty like it was in Paris. And the implementation of the Paris Agreement also means transitioning from pre-2020 climate finance debates towards the post-2020 climate finance debates, which actually include all the things that are needed to implement Paris Agreement everywhere. And, in 2015, the 100 billion was the critical piece that aimed to build trust, that developed countries will do their share to help developing countries implement Paris. Not only the 100 billion question needs to be sorted out in Glasgow, but all the other new pieces of climate finance will also need to be included in that basket. And that includes the discussions around adaptation financing, like my colleague Harjit has mentioned, discussions around loss and damage financing, which developing countries are critically asking, but that also includes the post-2020 finance goal, where the process is going to be negotiated in Glasgow as well. So we're looking at a very jam-packed climate finance agenda with more than 20 items that if we need to summarize in one single sentence is, how could we identify the resources that are needed, in particular in most vulnerable nations to the climate crisis, to keep 1.5 within reach? That is essentially the kind of discussion that we need to have in Glasgow. And that leads directly into a discussion about the trillions of dollars that are needed to unlock the energy transition and to keep us safe from future warming. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just check if anyone else has a question for any of our panelists. If you do, please feel free to just put an asterisk in the chat there. Si vous avez des questions, mettez une étoile dans le chat. Ou sinon, Rafi, go ahead and ask your other question.
Thanks, appreciate that. I was just wondering, coming back to this idea that they only are able to report whether they met the goal 2 years later. Now, you know, they seem to say that this is as fast as they can do it because of the various levels of reporting involved by different countries that make these pledges. Why is it so problematic that we only find out 2 years later from your point of view?
So it's not problematic that data comes in a little bit late. That's not the problem. The problem is the projection. Today, we won't be able to confirm that the 100 billion is not going to be met. It is going to be met in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. We will only know if what they deliver, that put on paper today, happens in 2025. How is it that we could have sorted out that piece of the puzzle? We needed certainty from countries' efforts on the 100 billion. Let me just give you an example. We know Canada has put forward $5.36 billion over 5 years. We have an idea about how much money Canada is going to give over the 5 years, but that is not the case for all the other 23 countries. We have done calculations, and in 2023, we might be able to already have an idea of the different shortfalls to get to the 100 billion. So the problem that we have right now is that the delivery plan doesn't show how much money each developed country has committed and who has not, so that we could do the calculations and try to address these shortfalls as soon as possible. That is what the problem is right now. And so they have to rely on different projections. They have to say, it is possible that other countries put more funding this year or next year. When we get to 2023, that might lead us towards 100 billion, and to compensate, to actually fill the gap, we're going to wait if the private sector mobilization comes in. And so the first year that happens is 2023. That is what's problematic.
Thanks, Eddie. I just wanted to see if any of our other speakers wanted to come in on any of this. If you had any thoughts to add, please feel free to unmute. Or if not, then I'll just check one more time. Is there anyone else with a question? Okay, great. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out the recording and the contact information for everyone this afternoon, so you can follow up with them if you'd like. And Shannon, I'll turn it back to you to wrap up.
Okay. Can I make one quick remark?
Absolutely.
Just to underline one more point, that since you'll be following COP26 very closely, you will also hear a lot more. Of course, UK government's focus is disproportionately on just achieving net zero. Make sure that countries commit to those net zero targets. I'm sure you must have noticed, a flurry of such commitments coming in. I think the question we all need to be asking, how real those commitments are when we are talking about 2050 and 2060. Where are those short-term plans? That's what is needed, because science tells us we have to halve our emissions by 2030. So if you're talking of 2050 and 60, are we really looking at the staying below 1.5 degree? And second, this COP just cannot be about net zero and those headline grabbing targets and jargons. We need to see real action in terms of finance, but also on loss and damage, which Climate Action Network has made its litmus test to judge the success of the COP itself. If this summit, this COP, doesn't protect the rights of people right now, how can we trust that it's going to help us stay below 1.5 or go for a greener and just transition? I think there are big questions. At 1.1 degree, people are losing homes, getting displaced. We need to protect them now, and that's why we are demanding for loss and damage stream. Thank you. Over to you, Shannon.
Great, thanks. Those are great concluding remarks, and I think I'll just end by reiterating that we are very privileged. The Canadian delegation is very privileged to be at numerous representation of civil society groups, and that our team, our members, our partners are going to be in Glasgow. And I'm going to reiterate my invitation to follow our daily posts and publications about what is going on in those negotiations and what it really means for climate change. And I think with that, we can end it for today. And thanks so much for coming, everybody, and for listening. And thanks so much to the speakers for sharing your expertise on these subjects.
Thank you.
Merci à tous.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Merci tout le monde.